In a world where leadership has been hollowed out by empty slogans and performative gestures, where boardrooms echo with jargon but lack conviction, and where young professionals are told to wait their turn while the world burns around them, the Rising Leader Handbook arrives like a flare in the night sky, a manifesto for those who refuse to be spectators in their own destiny. It confronts the modern crisis head-on, the crisis of leaders who manage but do not inspire, who calculate but do not risk, who speak but do not act. And it declares that the age of passive ambition is over, that the new frontier belongs to those willing to rise, to those who see leadership not as a title, but as a burden carried with fire in the chest and steel in the spine. This book is not about climbing ladders. It is about building bridges, not about waiting for permission, but about seizing the moment. And it challenges the viewer to ask themselves a brutal question. In the chaos of today's fractured workplaces, in the noise of social media echo chambers, in the fatigue of endless meetings, will you be the one who steps forward, who cuts through the fog, who becomes the rising leader the world is starving for? Or will you remain another shadow in the crowd, another name lost in the silence of history?
The first principle of the Rising Leader Handbook is brutal in its simplicity, yet transformative in its execution. Leadership begins not with authority, but with clarity. The ability to cut through the fog of confusion and articulate a vision so sharp it feels like a blade against the skin. The book insists that rising leaders are not born with charisma or gifted with titles. They are forged in the crucible of uncertainty, and their first act of power is to define reality for those around them, to say, this is where we are, this is where we must go, and this is why it matters. And in doing so, they ignite a spark of alignment that turns scattered individuals into a unified force. Imagine a young manager stepping into a chaotic startup where deadlines are missed, morale is fractured, and everyone is drowning in noise. Rather than hiding behind spreadsheets, she gathers her team, paints a vivid picture of the mission, strips away distractions, and sets a single, non-negotiable priority. And suddenly, the fog lifts, the team breathes, and momentum returns. This is clarity as leadership, not as a motivational poster, but as a weapon. And the book argues that without it, no strategy, no charisma, no amount of technical skill will matter, because people do not follow confusion, they follow conviction. And the rising leader's first duty is to wield clarity like a sword in the dark.
The second principle of the Rising Leader Handbook strikes at the heart of endurance and resilience, declaring that true leadership is not measured in moments of triumph, but in the long corridors of struggle, where fatigue gnaws at the will and doubt whispers in the dark. It insists that rising leaders are defined not by how they shine when the spotlight is on them, but by how they grind forward when no one is watching, when the applause has faded, and when the obstacles seem immovable. The book paints vivid portraits of leaders who endure storms, who keep running when the path is uphill, who refuse to surrender even when the finish line is invisible. And it challenges the reader to see leadership as a marathon, not a sprint, as a discipline of persistence rather than a flash of inspiration. Imagine a young professional facing rejection after rejection, projects collapsing, mentors doubting, yet she continues to show up, to refine her craft, to push her limits, and eventually her consistency becomes her credibility, her resilience becomes her reputation. This is the essence of the second principle, endurance as leadership, the refusal to quit when quitting would be easy, the stubbornness to keep moving when the world says stop. And the book argues that in an era obsessed with quick wins and instant gratification, the rising leader must embrace the grind, must wear resilience like armor, and must prove through persistence that they are worthy of the mantle of leadership.
The third principle of the Rising Leader Handbook is the art of influence, the ability to move people, not through coercion or manipulation, but through authentic persuasion rooted in trust. And here, the book takes a bold stance by contrasting its philosophy against other popular leadership texts. While Leaders Eat Last emphasizes service and sacrifice, and Atomic Habits focuses on incremental personal change, this handbook insists that rising leaders must master the skill of shaping collective momentum, of turning individual sparks into a wildfire of shared purpose. And it argues that influence is not about charisma alone, but about credibility earned through consistency, empathy, and vision. Imagine a young leader in a fractured organization where silos dominate and collaboration is a myth. Rather than issuing commands, she listens deeply, identifies common pain points, and reframes the mission in language that resonates across departments. And suddenly, the walls begin to crumble, the silos dissolve, and the team starts to move as one. This is influence as leadership, not a trick, but a transformation. And the book insists that in the digital age, where attention is fragmented and skepticism runs high, the rising leader must wield influence like a sculptor's chisel, shaping culture, shaping behavior, shaping destiny, and proving that leadership is not about standing above others, but about standing among them and guiding them toward a horizon they would never have reached alone. The fourth principle of the Rising Leader Handbook is execution, the ruthless discipline of turning vision into reality. Because ideas without action are hallucinations, and strategies without follow-through are nothing but theater. The book insists that rising leaders must be obsessed not with talking about change, but with engineering it, with building systems that transform intention into measurable progress. And it argues that execution is the battlefield where credibility is won or lost. Imagine a leader who rallies her team with inspiring speeches but never delivers results. Her words become noise, her promises dissolve, and her influence evaporates. But contrast that with the leader who sets clear goals, tracks progress relentlessly, and holds herself accountable to the same standards she demands of others. And suddenly, execution becomes the proof of leadership, the evidence that vision is not just a dream, but a plan unfolding in real time. The handbook challenges readers to embrace execution as a craft, to master the tools of project management, to sweat the details, to anticipate obstacles, and to build momentum through small wins that compound into breakthroughs. And it declares that in a world drowning in talkers, the rising leader must be a doer, a builder, a finisher, someone whose reputation is forged not in the brilliance of their ideas, but in the consistency of their results. Because leadership without execution is fraud, and execution without leadership is chaos, but together they form the spine of transformation. The fifth principle of the Rising Leader Handbook is courage, the raw willingness to step into uncertainty and confront fear head-on. Because without courage, every other principle collapses into theory, and the book insists that rising leaders must be defined not by the safety of their choices, but by the risks they are willing to embrace. It argues that clarity without courage is fragile, endurance without courage is hollow, influence without courage is manipulative, and execution without courage is mechanical. And so courage becomes the keystone, the force that animates all others. Imagine a young leader faced with a decision that could either protect her career or propel her team forward. She knows the safe path will keep her comfortable but stagnant, while the bold path carries risk of failure yet promises transformation. And in choosing the bold path, she not only proves her own mettle, but gives her team permission to be brave, to innovate, to stretch beyond their limits. The handbook declares that courage is contagious, that one act of bravery can ripple through an organization like fire through dry grass, and it challenges the reader to see courage not as recklessness, but as calculated defiance, the refusal to let fear dictate destiny, the insistence that leadership is not about avoiding danger, but about facing it with conviction. And it concludes that in a world paralyzed by hesitation, the rising leader must be the one who moves first, who speaks truth when silence is easier, who lights the torch in the cave and dares others to follow. The critical analysis of the Rising Leader Handbook is where its voice sharpens into defiance, because unlike many leadership texts that recycle familiar tropes, this book carves out its own territory by challenging the assumptions embedded in popular titles. Take Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek, which champions servant leadership and the noble act of putting others first. Valuable, yes, but often romanticized to the point of impracticality in cutthroat environments where survival demands more than altruism. And contrast that with Atomic Habits by James Clear, which brilliantly dissects the mechanics of personal behavior change, but often leaves the reader stranded in the realm of micro-adjustments without addressing the larger systemic forces at play. The Rising Leader Handbook refuses to be confined to either camp, insisting instead that leadership is both personal and structural, both empathetic and ruthless, both visionary and tactical. And it argues that rising leaders must synthesize these dimensions rather than choose between them. Imagine a leader who borrows Sinek's empathy but tempers it with Clear's discipline, who serves her team yet demands accountability, who builds habits yet dismantles toxic systems, and suddenly leadership becomes not a philosophy but a practice, a living fusion of ideals and execution. This is the originality of the handbook. It does not worship at the altar of one school of thought, but instead forges a hybrid model, a gritty, pragmatic framework that acknowledges the complexity of modern leadership and equips the rising leader to thrive where others falter.
The handbook refuses to let leadership remain abstract, and so it delivers a 7-day action plan designed to drag the principles out of theory and into the grit of daily practice, beginning with Day 1 and Day 2, where the rising leader must confront the chaos of their environment and impose order. On Day 1, the challenge is ruthless clarity. Take 30 minutes to strip your workspace, your calendar, and your commitments down to the essentials. Eliminate distractions, cancel one meeting that adds no value, and write a single sentence that defines your mission for the week. Because clarity is not a concept, it is a discipline. On Day 2, the focus shifts to endurance. Commit to one task that feels uncomfortable, whether it is a difficult conversation, a long stretch of deep work, or a physical challenge, and push through it without retreat, because resilience is built in the trenches of discomfort, not in the comfort of routine. The handbook insists that these first 2 days are not about grand gestures, but about setting tone, proving to yourself and to those around you that you are serious, that you are willing to cut through noise and embrace struggle. And it argues that by the end of Day 2, you will already feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable momentum of someone who is no longer drifting but deliberately rising, someone who has chosen to lead, not someday, but now. By Day 3 and Day 4, the handbook shifts gears from personal discipline into collective empowerment, because leadership is not a solitary pursuit, but a force that multiplies when shared. On Day 3, the rising leader is challenged to initiate a team huddle, not the sterile kind filled with updates and metrics, but a raw, authentic gathering where the leader articulates the mission, listens to frustrations, and ignites a sense of shared ownership. Because influence without engagement is hollow, and the team must feel the pulse of the vision in their own veins. On Day 4, the focus sharpens into collaboration. Choose one project, however small, and dismantle the silos around it.
Invite voices from different departments, perspectives, or skill sets, and prove that unity is not a slogan but a practice, because the rising leader's credibility is measured not in how well they perform alone, but in how effectively they orchestrate collective momentum. The handbook insists that these midweek exercises are the crucible where trust is forged, where the leader proves that clarity, endurance, and courage are not personal trophies, but shared assets. And it argues that by the end of day 4, the team will feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable energy of a group that is no longer fragmented but aligned, no longer passive but mobilized. And the rising leader will stand not as a solitary figure, but as the conductor of a symphony of ambition.
By day 5 and day 6, the handbook demands escalation, pushing the rising leader beyond comfort into the realm of advanced discipline, because leadership is not sustained by bursts of inspiration, but by the grind of consistency. On day 5, the challenge is radical accountability. Write down 3 promises you have made to your team or yourself, and then publicly declare progress on each, even if imperfect, because credibility is not built on flawless execution, but on transparent ownership of the journey. And the handbook insists that leaders who hide their failures lose trust, while those who confront them earn respect. On day 6, the focus sharpens into personal mastery. Commit to a discipline that stretches your limits, whether it is waking at dawn to work on strategy, fasting from digital distractions for 12 hours, or tackling a project that terrifies you. Because courage without discipline is reckless, and discipline without courage is sterile. But together, they forge the steel of leadership. The handbook argues that these 2 days are the crucible where the rising leader proves they are not just motivated, but methodical, not just bold, but consistent. And it declares that by the end of day 6, the leader will feel the shift in their own identity, the transformation from someone who aspires to lead into someone who embodies leadership. Someone whose habits, actions, and accountability radiate authority without needing to be announced. Day 7 is the crucible, the moment where the rising leader steps fully into identity, because after 6 days of clarity, endurance, influence, execution, and courage, the final challenge is integration, taking the fragments of practice and fusing them into a whole. The handbook insists that leadership is not a series of disconnected acts, but a rhythm, a way of being. And so on day 7, the rising leader must design a ritual, a personal ceremony that anchors the week's transformation into permanence. Whether it is a dawn reflection where you write down the single most important lesson learned, a physical act like climbing a hill to mark the ascent, or a symbolic gesture like lighting a candle and declaring aloud the mission you now embody. The point is not the ritual itself, but the declaration of identity, the moment where you stop saying, "I am learning to lead," and begin saying, "I am a leader." Because the handbook argues that identity precedes action, that once you see yourself as a leader, you will act as one, and once you act as one, others will follow. Imagine standing at sunrise, exhausted but alive, declaring to yourself and to the world that hesitation is dead, that fear has been buried, that leadership is no longer a dream but a discipline. And in that moment, the rising leader is born, not in theory, but in practice, not in aspiration, but in reality, forged in 7 days of deliberate transformation. And yet, even as the handbook drives home its principles with relentless force, it does not leave the rising leader stranded in theory. It offers a bridge, a direct path to continue the journey, reminding the viewer that the tools, the frameworks, and the deeper strategies are waiting in the book itself, available through the link in the description. The mention is subtle,
woven into the narrative, not as a sales pitch, but as an invitation, a reminder that leadership is not mastered in a single video, but cultivated through immersion in the text, through study, through practice, and the handbook becomes the companion on that path. The disclosure is clear, transparent, and compliant. As an Amazon associate, I earn from qualifying purchases. My affiliate ID is bestdeals098520. This supports @bestbooksummary. The book is not presented as a product, but as a weapon, a manual for those who refuse to drift. And the affiliate bridge is not a distraction, but a continuation, a way for the viewer to step beyond the screen and into the discipline of rising leadership. The handbook insists that leaders are readers, that transformation begins with immersion, and so the link becomes more than commerce. It becomes commitment, the moment where the viewer decides whether they will remain passive consumers of ideas or active practitioners of leadership, whether they will scroll past or step forward, whether they will remain in the crowd or rise into the ranks of those who lead. The handbook refuses to exist in isolation, insisting that leadership must be understood within the brutal context of our times, because the rising leader is not stepping into a vacuum, but into a world fractured by global crises, technological disruption, and cultural upheaval. It argues that leadership today is not about maintaining stability, but about navigating volatility, about steering through storms where the map itself is dissolving. And it challenges the reader to see themselves not as managers of routine, but as architects of resilience. Imagine the global stage where pandemics have rewritten the rules of work, where artificial intelligence is reshaping industries overnight, where climate change threatens supply chains and communities alike, and where trust in institutions has eroded to dangerous lows. This is the battlefield into which the rising leader must march, armed not with nostalgia, but with adaptability, not with rigid dogma, but with flexible vision. The handbook insists that leaders who cling to the past will be broken by the future, but those who embrace uncertainty, who see disruption as opportunity, who build cultures of agility and courage, will thrive. It declares that leadership in context is not about ignoring the chaos, but about mastering it, about standing at the intersection of crisis and possibility and choosing to rise. And it concludes that the rising leader is not just a figure in an organization, but a force in history, someone who shapes the trajectory of communities, companies, and nations in the crucible of change. The handbook doesn't end with theory or even with action steps. It ends with empowerment, a direct challenge to the viewer to claim their place in the story of leadership. Because the rising leader is not a spectator, but a protagonist. Not someone who waits for permission, but someone who seizes the moment. It insists that leadership is not reserved for CEOs or generals, but belongs to anyone willing to step forward, whether in a classroom, a startup, a community, or a family. And it declares that the viewer must stop asking who will lead and begin answering, I will. Imagine the ripple effect if every person watching this video decided to embody clarity, endurance, influence, execution, and courage. Teams would transform, organizations would ignite, communities would rise, and history itself would bend under the weight of new leaders refusing to remain silent. The handbook insists that empowerment is not about inspiration alone, but about responsibility, about recognizing that the world is starving for leaders, and that hesitation is betrayal. And it challenges the viewer to see themselves not as passive consumers of content, but as active architects of destiny. To take the principles of the book and carve them into their daily lives, to rise not someday, but today. Because the truth is brutal yet liberating. No one is coming to save us. No one is coming to lead us. And so the rising leader must be you, must be now, must be here. And so the handbook closes not with comfort, but with urgency, a final strike meant to pierce the heart of hesitation. Because the truth is merciless. History does not remember the passive, it remembers the bold. And the rising leader is not a concept, but a choice, a decision made in the fire of the present moment. The book insists that the world is starving for leaders who will act, who will risk, who will rise, and it challenges the viewer to confront the brutal reality that time is slipping, opportunities are vanishing, and silence is betrayal. Imagine standing at the edge of your own horizon, the path ahead blazing with possibility, yet littered with fear. And imagine choosing to step forward anyway, to claim the mantle of leadership, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. The handbook declares that hesitation is death, that waiting for permission is surrender, and that the rising leader must be forged now, in this moment, in this decision, because tomorrow is too late, and someday is a lie. It concludes with a call that is both invitation and demand. Rise, lead, act, because the world will not wait, history will not pause, and your destiny will not write itself. You must write it. You must seize it. You must become the rising leader the world is desperate for, or risk fading into the silence of those who never dared.